Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center, and I'm Laurie O'Neill, your host today. Books in the World is an interview show that showcases writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field. The Writers Center was established 57 years ago, and Books in the World has been broadcasting continuously for 41 years. We sponsor a 4-day annual summer conference, which will be virtual again this summer. And today we are delighted to welcome Tess Gerritsen and Gary Braver, authors of Choose Me. Welcome, Tess and Gary. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to share a little bit about your bios and your riveting page turner, Choose Me, and then we'll open up the conversation. So international best-selling author Tess Gerritsen took an unusual route to a writing career. It wasn't until she was on maternity leave from her job as a physician that she began to write. Since then, she's written 28 suspense novels with more than 30 million copies sold. Her books have been translated into 40 languages, and her series featuring homicide detective Jane Rizzoli and medical examiner Maura Isles inspired the hit TNT series Rizzoli and Isles, starring Angie Harmon and Sasha Alexander. Tess now writes full-time and lives in Maine. Gary Braver, pen name of college professor Gary Gushgarian, is the best-selling author of 8 critically acclaimed mysteries and thrillers, including Gray Matter and Flashback, the first thriller to win the Massachusetts Book Award. His work has been translated into several languages, and 2 have been optioned for film, including Elixir. As Gary Gushgarian, he teaches science fiction, horror fiction, bestsellers, and fiction writing at Northeastern University. Gary lives with his family outside Boston. So I was completely transfixed by your evocative, whodunit psychological thriller, Choose Me. And you know, Lisa Unger's book review is one of my favorites. She writes, "Don't miss this edgy, twisting, rocket-paced story of marriage, betrayal, and the damage that we do to each other in the name of love." So it's written from both the female and male perspectives, which is a rarity in the publishing world. And Choose Me unfolds as a tale of obsession, unrequited love, betrayal, and it's a murder mystery where the lines are definitely blurred between victim and villain. Tess and Gary, you're emotionally charged yet poignant page turner. It's told from alternating perspectives and different points in time. It had me riveted from the beginning, and I can't wait to dive in with our listeners. So could you please tell us a little bit about your writing journeys and how you first met and why you decided to write a book together? Tess, let's start with you.
Well, we've known each other for a quarter of a century, just as fellow writers, and I've dropped into Gary's class to teach a class every so often. Mm-hmm. And we were together a couple Christmases ago at a cocktail party in a bookstore. And I was paying attention at that time to the Me Too movement, which was really in the news. So many men were getting into trouble and so many secrets were being revealed. And I was telling them it would be interesting to write about that situation, but from both a male and a female point of view, because every illicit affair has 2 points of view, the man's and the woman's. And how would they see that situation differently? So that's how the idea came about. It was just Me Too, man and woman. I would write the female point of view, he would write the male point of view, and let's see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. Gary, how about you?
And that was a turning moment in my life, me to write a book with her. And then decide what the context would be. We thought about maybe a medical context or having a couple of astronomers or an astronomy professor and a student. But I was neither familiar with the medical or the astronomical as much as I would with a college life. And yes. So we decided a new wine in an old bottle, a professor and a student having an illicit relationship. And there are antecedents that go back 1,000 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, the whole Me Too movement, as you say, was so compelling at the time when you were writing. So tell us a little bit more how that plays in. Give us a little bit about the plot and your main characters, please.
I think the discussion we talked about was during the exposure of a lot of guys for sexual misbehavior was that there's a whole spectrum of abuse, you know, from winking or, you know, an uninvited kiss to, you know, sexual assault. And we decided to look at that in the layers of it in terms of a professor having an affair with a student, and knowing that it is a violation, that it would be a violation of his marriage vows as well as a violation of his position as a professor in violation of the federal compliance laws about not having romantic relationships with a student. So that is what we began with, and it just was back and forth on what would be the shape of the story, where it would go, and how to begin. Would we begin with a dead body, or would we lead up to it? And that was how we determined to structure it, and came up with a great idea.
That first chapter was perfectly. Oh my God! It just gets you right from the get go, and actually, I wrote just two brief lines. It was on page 5. Let me just find that framed the whole Me Too question right from the get go. You have two detectives, male, female, who come into this scene, and Frankie and Mac are their name. And the young Taryn has, plunged off the balcony. That's, in the first scene. So Mac joins Frankie on the balcony, to discuss. And he says, looks like she was a pretty girl. What a waist, he sighs. If she were ugly, it would still be a waist, Mac. I mean, Tess, that was like right away, spot on. You captured it immediately right there.
Yeah, it's male versus female. This whole book is about how men see things so differently from women. And that's why I chose to use a female middle-aged detective paired with a middle-aged man, because you're seeing this back and forth. You're seeing the male-female thing play out in their partnership, which is very cordial. These two people like each other a lot, but they are different people. And it's a reflection of society in general. How do men look at women, especially how do men look at older women? I'm just always fascinated by how, as women get older, they become invisible. And Frankie, our detective, uses that to her advantage, because she knows nobody's paying attention to her, so she can do her work sort of in the background.
Oh, she was like one of my fabulously. I loved her. I just loved Frankie, and she wove it in and out, especially in the different interviews that they brought out with other cases that they were doing. The one about domestic violence, which was very telling. And again, the man wasn't even looking at her that was being interviewed, because she was invisible, as you said, Tess. But underneath it all, that her brain, she was just spot on right there. Very, very amazing. So how did you write? You guys were in different states. You were, how did you write this book together?
A matter of just exchanging emails with attachments. We would decide on what scene would come next. One of us would write it and send it to the other, and the other would give a stamp of approval or make some suggestions for changes. And it worked. We'd written several books, and so we're easily cued as to what needs to be done if one of us gives us the proper kind of term. I think it needs more mystery, or it needs more emotional, more emotions, or it needs some subtlety. And I think we responded pretty well to that. And so it was just back and forth through emails. And we only had, I think, 2 telephone calls in the 2 years that we were working on this, and the rest was all exchanges online. Yeah.
Wow.
One thing that changed quite a bit from the first draft to the final version was that we wrote it in chronologic order. So you start off with the affair, you end up with all the complications, and then you end up with the dead student. And then Frankie, the detective, doesn't come in until maybe 2/3 of the way through the book. So we had written the whole first draft that way. And since I've done film, what went on from there was getting back into the editing room, taking all this stuff that we had filmed essentially, and fitting it back all together. And we chose to go start off with the present and then go back into the past. I like to liken it to, okay, you've seen a train wreck happen. Now let's go back in time and see how we got to this train wreck.
I think that was such a beautiful way to catch us and to keep us. And you get to the end of the chapter, and then you're thrown to a whole different time period, and you're like, oh, and then the pieces, as you say, Gary, the puzzles have to come together, but then did I put the right piece in that place? No, I get to the next chapter. I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding me. Cody, he was a very interesting character. So anybody want to talk a little bit about him?
Cody,
he was Gary's invention. So Gary.
Let's hear about Cody.
Cody's almost an archetype of a kind of a really smart kid, but has kind of a low self-image. He is outsized, and he's probably bullied as a kid, and he takes to this very attractive classmate, If it were high school, he'd be carrying her books to school.
Absolutely.
And he's smart, so he exchanges notes in class and probably, help her write a paper or whatever. But he is like so many students I have had. They're kind of in the background. They're very bright and they're very helpful, and sometimes abused. And there
Yeah.
is some abuse he takes within the story.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, Taryn, let's talk about your main characters, Taryn and Jack. So, tell our listeners a little bit about both, please.
Taryn is a very complicated young woman. You don't necessarily have to like her. That's my point, is that, yes, she is one of the major characters, but she's so complex and she's so complicated that you may be fascinated, but you may not want her in your life. I mean, I like to think of one of my favorite fictional characters is Scarlett O'Hara,
Hmm.
who's totally flawed and nobody really likes her, but you can't stop reading about her because she's interesting. And that's what I was trying for with Taryn, is not somebody necessarily sympathetic, but somebody who's, you just can't look away. You just want to see what she's going to do next.
Totally, totally. My girlfriend who's now reading it, she immediately did not like her and found her as the villain, and yet I didn't. Jack, on the other hand, I didn't like him very much after a while when he just kept, giving in to his male. Yes, Gary, talk about Jack a little bit, please. Tell.
That's quite true. One of the things that makes my heart leap up in review is people say it's realistic, and we are going for real people. The knock in the archetype and the heroine for damage, really low scenario. The challenge I had was making a guy who violates his marriage vows and who steps over the line with making him sympathetic. I empathize with him. And I want him not to be as pathetic, nor do I want to have him be perceived as a villain. I mean, he is quite trite. He feels great guilt. He regrets what he had done. He wants his marriage to last. He had never done what he had done. And that, I think, was the of every kind of empathy a reader has for him. I had empathy for him, and I tried to project that in the writing.
Yeah, and I did too at times. I think that when Taryn's her personality was so striking and so deep and dark in many ways, Tess. Her history, her story, coming from a less than privileged background than the original boyfriend, Liam, that's introduced. He's another character in the book. But she is riveting, and she just is possessed. And it's interesting how the theme of the book, in terms of her, like, they come across her thesis paper in the first chapter, and her thesis is Hell Hath No Fury, Violence in the Scorned Woman. And then how that, in conjunction with Jack's course title, Star-Crossed Lovers, it propels the plot as it moves forward. Let's talk a little bit about those themes that you guys brought into with the medieval literature. I learned a lot, actually, reading the book.
I think the difference between life and literature is literature has to make sense.
Mhm.
And I think you're absolutely right, Laurie, that there was this thematic glue that held it all together. I had not been familiar with Aeneas, the Aeneid, Aeneas versus Dido, and Terry jumped right in with that suggestion. I'll let Terry pick up from there. But I was familiar with the legendary lovers of Abelard and Eloise, the 12th century star-crossed lovers. The older professor, the young, brilliant student, she probably was 14 at the time, and he probably was 40. And so I knew that and a few others, but Terry introduced the Aeneas, and that was vital. The Aeneid, I should say, rather.
Mm-hmm.
Terry?
Yes, yeah, talk to me.
Yeah, in trying to understand Karen and give her a sympathetic spin, because yes, she does terrible things, but at the same time, we want to understand why she is the way she is. I was drawing back on my own sympathy for the legendary Queen Dido, who falls in love with King Aeneas, and then he abandons her, and she commits suicide on her own pyre. That's a heartbreaking scene.
Mhm.
And you just think maybe a different woman would have done something different. Maybe she would have picked up that sword and killed her lover instead. It really all depends on what kind of a woman you are. And I wanted to play it against that background. Are you going to be passive and commit suicide? Or are you going to take charge of your life and get back at the person who really, really hurt you? And Taryn has to make that choice.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she does. She does, and she certainly does. So the Me Too movement also, if you can talk a little bit more about, so the Title IX office is pulling him in, and there were so many warnings for Jack. And, I just was like, listen. I mean, look what she wants to write about, I mean, oh my God.
Exactly.
Human frailty is probably one of the major themes of this, is that how we all make mistakes. Sometimes our mistakes come back to destroy our lives, and sometimes we get away with it.
Yeah.
So I think that we really wanted to explore people, the real people who are not perfect, people who make mistakes. And this was the challenge that I think Gary handled very well, which is this very flawed man.
Mm-hmm.
How do we come to like him at the end? And a lot of the story has to do. It's almost it's a story about guilt and how guilt is so destructive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Guilt, but also regret that he had done it. So that is, somewhat of a redeeming aspect of his being tormented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, the characters of his wife, I loved Maggie, and I thought you captured really well, how marriages get to that point where, you're in those routines and you need to find ways to, connect with each other. And they were clearly going in the opposite directions when this all unfolded, which isn't an excuse, so to say, but it definitely helped me to have empathy for him, as you said, Gary. And then Charlie, who is fascinating, which is Maggie's dad, who's the, Boston retired physician. Want to talk a little bit about him?
Sorry?
Oh, okay. Yes. Maggie's dad's actually a retired cop, Boston PD police officer.
Yeah.
Right. So he's seen it all and done it all. And what we loved about him is that he loves his daughter so much. His whole life is about protecting his daughter. And we know men like that. We've had a good relationship with your father. You know what it's like to be in the protective arms of that paternal character. So I think that's what we were really trying for, is that this man nothing else matters as much in his life as making sure his daughter is happy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So
their father and daughter closeness is also something that makes Jack a little envious. In their earlier days, they were they had repartee, they shared jokes, they witticism, and yet he's seen that having shifted there, and he almost feels kind of left out, and also left out today from what they used to have a long time ago, a warmer, closer relationship. So he's somewhat of a foil to Jack, or this is a source of envy. But he is very protective and comes from a job of having protected society as a Cambridge cop.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tess, you were a physician also, as well as a writer, and how did that all play in and influence your storytelling with this book?
Oh, first of all, there was an autopsy scene.
Yeah.
It really helped to be a doctor to be able to, because there were some vital clues that were revealed in this autopsy scene.
Mm-hmm.
And the death scene, that helped. But I think mainly it helped in understanding what Maggie's job is. She is a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
What are the requirements of a doctor? What pulls you out of your bed in the middle of the night to go to the hospital?
Mm-hmm.
And how does she think? How does she react to her patients? So that played into the story, and also played into the story because Charlie, Maggie's father, is going through a very serious illness, and I could understand what the diagnostic procedures would be that he would have to go through.
Yeah, and that was interwoven beautifully, absolutely. And as was academia, Gary. I mean, that's your forte, obviously. So tell us a little bit about your professorship in Northeastern and what you teach.
I've been there forever, and I teach. I started a course in science fiction 40 years ago because my background's in physics, and I had read it by the pound as a kid. And I got to know Stephen King, and 40 years ago, I asked him if he came to class, I would start a horror fiction. He said, sure, I'll come to class. So I started a horror fiction course, which is a first, still
Fabulous.
going. And yeah, and then I started a bestsellers course because my office mate was Robert B. Parker, and one of my first, he was one of our early guests, as was Tess. So I've had a fabulous career at Northeastern, teaching exactly what I want to teach, and as long as I wanted to teach it. And I've been teaching fiction writing for the last 40 years also. So I kind of practice what I preach, or preach what I practice. So it works both ways.
Absolutely. And Tess, so what about the switch from physician to writer? I mean, were you always a wannabe writer? And tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah. I wrote my first book when I was 7 years old. I even bound it together myself with needle and thread. And
Oh,
lest you think it's a sellable thing, it was a biography of my dead cat. So that was I was dealing with death even back then. But I went to medical school partly because I'm interested in science, but also because my father was convinced I would never make a living as a writer. We didn't know any writers. I was this little kid. To me, a novelist was somebody who lived on Mars, and certainly there were no Asian American novelists that I was aware of. So it just seemed like something that would be completely unrealistic. It was only after I finished medical school and was working as a doctor that I decided to, take some time and write my first book. But I was writing all the way through college and medical school.
Wonderful. So, Gary, in one of the interviews I watched of you, you mentioned you were talking about this book, and you mentioned the title as being "Thou Shalt Not," and then it ended up being "Choose Me." So I'm very intrigued about the title, and how did that shift, and how did you guys finally decide on the title?
I think we had about 10 different titles. It started off with he, she, which I was using as my file. And then it went to all sorts of iterations. The girl who fell, and thou shalt not. That was a suggestion of my wife. And Terry came with choose.
Titles are coming up with the right title is excruciating. And having written actually 30 books and having to deal with this every single time, about half the time the title is my idea. The other half it's somebody, either it's the editor who comes up or a friend. And this was particularly difficult. I think the reason we did not use "Thou Shalt Not" was our agent really didn't like it.
Right.
It was off-putting. "Thou Shalt Not" just seems like, don't pick up this book.
True. I didn't even think of that.
There was something about the title "Choose Me," which was, okay, I need to pick up this book. So a lot of titling is not only about the story, but what's marketable.
Absolutely. So were there any challenges in writing a book together? I mean, is this the first time you've both co-authored a book together? With somebody else?
It's the first time I've co-authored it.
Yeah. So what was the
challenges with I think the challenge is making sure that the other person liked what we were doing and that it was heading in the right direction. So the back and forth. But as I said, we use the same language, and that made it easier. I would never recommend any of my students co-authoring a book as the first foray into fiction. That would be disastrous. But this worked, and I respected what Tess suggested, and I think she respected what I suggested, making changes.
Well, I think the biggest challenge was we didn't always agree on where the plot was going. We knew this was going to be a nightmare for Jack, but who did it? I don't think we settled on the on the killer until maybe 2/3 of the way through the first draft.
That is fascinating.
This is the way I always write. I never know who my villain is until.
Yeah. I'm still working on a book right now. I'm not quite sure who done. I'm 2/3 through, but the thing is, we know that if you choose character B instead of character A, you have to go back and adjust everything and lead up to it, so that you're not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And so I think that was rather interesting. You're two inveterate writers, and 2/3 through the novel, we had no idea, but we each examined what if this character, what if that character, and how it would be logical or illogical, and I think we made the right choice.
And that was all done through email primarily. You said you only spoke on the phone twice? Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. How long did this take you to pull this all together, this story?
2 years. 2 years, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, but there were lots of holes. And Terry was doing a lot of international traveling. I was doing some international traveling. Then I was teaching full time. So it was, because you wait another 3 weeks to finish the same show.
Mhm.
And I had another book that I had to write, so which
Ah.
ended up getting finished not too long after this one.
Mhm. So what are you two working on now?
Mhm. I'm sorry. I finished recently a book called Served Cold. It is a whodunit also.
Mhm.
For any writer who's ever been trashed by a critic, they'll love it. It's about a guy whose third book is supposed to be his big breakout book. He's came from nowhere. His agent, his editor, and all his friends say this is going to be this is going to put you into bestsellerdom, and he is trashed in the New York Times by a young writer who's hoping to get tenure at his university, trashed, and that just is the death knell for all the dreams that he had, and he goes after the critic.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
That sounds fascinating. How
Yeah,
about you, Tess?
Well, I just turned in my 13th Rizzoli and Dials book, which will be coming out in June of 22. It's called Listen to Me. And one about it is it really focuses on Jane's mother, Angela, who's a housewife in Revere. And what does she see looking out her living room window? And why does nobody believe her that she knows crime that's going on in her neighborhood? And then I'm now at work on another novel, which is completely out of series. It's a spy novel.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we're coming up closer to the end of our time. So this was wonderful. Please, everybody, you've got to choose me. It's just riveting, and you can't put it down. Thank you both for joining us. But can you please let our listeners know how they can connect with you and where they can get your book? It's coming out July 1st, right?
This book is available everywhere. So
Right.
The easiest way is just to go onto Amazon or
There you go.
Barnes and Noble has it in there, yes, as well. And it should be in physical form in most bookstores.
Right.
Great.
July 1st. Yeah.
Yep. Do you have anything coming up that you'd like to share with our listeners around this book? Are you doing any kind of a tour? I mean, things are opening up finally. We don't have to do all virtual anymore, right?
We are doing all virtual.
Pretty much.
Oh, you
Yeah,
are?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that probably makes sense since you're from different parts of the country, so that makes perfect sense. Well, thank you both again. This was just an amazing, amazing story, and please, everybody, go out and get it. It's fabulous. Tess, Gary, thank you again, and choose me.